I was born and raised in Bulawayo in Rhodesia. And that's obviously where Mzilikazi spent the last 30 years of his life. So I was somewhat exposed to Mzilikazi growing up there. The high school that I went to was actually physically on the grounds of what was once Lobengula's kraal. So for 5 years of my life, that was ground zero. And I actually, as a young teenager, went to Mzilikazi's grave site. So it's kind of been an interest of mine for a long time. So to start with, Mzilikazi means the Great Road, not, as lots of people say, the Great River of Blood or the Path of Blood. So just remember that. And this is just some of my reference material that I got into. Up at the top there, in 1926, Campbell wrote a book about the rise and fall of the Matabele. It wasn't a reference work of mine. He influenced A.T. Bryant, who wrote Olden Times in Zululand and Natal 3 years later. And that kind of became the gold standard for the history of Mzilikazi for many, many years. Peter Becker wrote a book that I really respect him, Path of Blood, The Rise and Conquest of Mzilikazi. That was in 1962. And at the time he wrote that, there was stuff he didn't know about. But nevertheless, a fantastic book on which much of my presentation is based. Then a fellow called Kent Rasmussen in the 70s. So we're still talking 40-odd, mid-40s years ago. He wrote a book called Migrant Kingdom, and he did quite a few papers. His, I think, master's thesis or master's thesis were on Mzilikazi. And these were a revelation. He uncovered a lot of documentation from all the tribes south of the Vaal who had been conquered by Mzilikazi, which those top three authors knew nothing about because it wasn't available to them. It was deep in the archives somewhere. For some reason, Kent Rasmussen found it. So now we have a much fuller picture of what Mzilikazi got up to. 27 years ago, Pistorius, it's a paper, the Matabele village, which eluded history, and I'll talk about that presently. That's just outside Rustenburg. It was also one of those unsolved mysteries. And then now in the 7 years ago, Retief of the Military History Society, I think it's called, did a fantastic article on the Battle of Mosega, which was very, very useful for this presentation. And then I made use of Vincent Carruthers' book, Cradle of Life, and there was some good stuff in there that helped me. So that's just some of the reference material. And I'm showing you these maps because I'm a spatially orientated person. Everything I have to see spatially. I can only understand a story if it's all spatial. So this is just an example of some of the maps one has to work with. And these are 40, 50, 60 plus years old, a lot of them. They are sketch maps, they're not to scale. And trying to piece together the routes that he took and all that kind of information took me quite a few weeks of putting this onto Google Earth. And fortunately, in a lot of them, you'll see the river systems, and from that, one can trace the lines quite accurately. This is just an overview of what I did on Google Earth. All the domains of the tribes, Mzilikazi, all the routes, all the rivers, and about 150 place names from all of the books. And you'll see this as we go along with the presentation. So let's start. I drew a timeline of the lifespan of Mzilikazi's life. He lived to be 78. And these are kind of stepping stones in his career, if you want to call it that. Zululand, Mpumalanga, Vaal, Magaliesburg, Marika, and Matabeleland. And my focus for this talk is on those central 10 years, from 1827 to 1837, where about half of the time he was in the Magaliesberg and the other half in the Marika. This is an important fact. What are the reasons why so little is known about Mzilikazi? Is that the written history of the Ndebele commenced in 1829, when the first Europeans reached Mzilikazi's court. And that's that red line, which is sort of in the early years when he was in Magaliesberg. So it's important to realize that everything before that is just oral history. I don't think much archaeological work's been done. So it's just important to keep that in mind. And then I want to talk about the Mfokani or the Difekwani on the same time scale of Mzilikazi's life. The trigger to the Mfokani was a terrible drought from 1795 to about 1800. And this has been documented through dendrochronology now. And there was another drought a year later. What was that, about a 5-year-long drought? And that was a mega drought. Nothing like that had probably been experienced in centuries. And the people took to raiding each other. This was the trigger of the Mfokani. The main phase of the Mfokani was here from 1815 to 1840, 35 years. And guess who was right in the middle of it? It was Mzilikazi. Amongst others, there were a lot of people responsible for the Mfokani, but he certainly played a major role. And this is interesting. Between 1.5 million and 2 million people were killed during the Mfokani. And it works out at a rough average of 135,000 per year. So just think about that. Right. Just a quick overview of where we're going with tonight's talk. That area in tan is the area of Mzilikazi's influence, and the yellow cells are what I call his domains. There's 7 of them there, and the orange lines are the routes he took connecting up all the domains. His overall area of influence, according to the Google Earth polygon, 615,000 square kilometers, which is about the size of France or Ukraine. So let's just start from the beginning. He was born in 1790 near Mkuzi. His full name is Mzilikazi Mashobane. He was born into the Khumalo lineage group. He became a vassal, firstly of the Ndwandwe leader Zwide, and later the Zulu king Shaka. Shaka posted Mzilikazi at the northern frontier of his new domain. I'll show you that on a map now, allowing the Khumalo to reoccupy their former homes. And Mzilikazi inherited the chieftainship of a section of the northern Khumalo. So here we are on Google Earth. That sort of purple cell in the middle is the Zulu heartland. At the top is Ngome, and at the bottom is Mgungundlovo there, but known today as Makosini, the Valley of the Kings. And at the top right there is Mkuzi. Somewhere along the line, Mzilikazi, as a young lad, moved into the Khumalo homeland, that yellow cell at the top. But they were displaced due to fighting with Zwide and all sorts of other stuff. And they were moved down here to the sort of southwestern corner of the Zulu heartland. And at that time, Shaka was here at this Mgungundlovo, Mtonjineni area. And he then moved his kraal to, the first kraal was called KwaBulawayo, the second one also, or Gibikego. He moved down there, and he allowed or promoted Mzilikazi to take the Khumalos back up there. So that's next to, that's Ngome and Ngome Forest. And that's a Google Earth view of where he established his kraal. His kraal was called Entubeni, and it was on, and here's Ntumbani Hill. Strategically, this was a brilliant position. He was on a plateau here, and he had this sort of fortress in front of him, very easily defensible. And all the way around this high ground, they had rocks ready to throw down on the enemies. And this is where he lived for a while. But then he got a bit greedy, and he went off and raided someone's cattle and wouldn't give the cattle back to Shaka, or all of them. And Shaka came and successfully dislodged him from this seemingly impregnable place that he had. And then he set off migrating to the north. The first kraal he plundered was the Nyawos, just there. And he quickly stocked up on cattle and grain and whatever he needed. And he headed up through the eastern Transvaal. That blue river is the Usutu River. And he swung to the west. And he entered this area here, which was the domain of the Puting tribe. And he didn't really establish a kraal, but he had a kraal called, or he named his kraal Ekupumuleni, the place of rest. And according to 4 different authors, but using all that old literature, they placed the kraals here somewhere. This is Hendrina, and that's Brayton. And these are the sources of the 4 big rivers. The Olifants, the Klein Olifants, the Komati, and the Vaal all rise near Brayton here. And so somewhere here, we don't really know. He took over the Puting kraals, and he hung around, but not for very long. Just took all their cattle and everything he needed. And again, headed up north. He went up through what is today Dullstroom. One author says he went through Resenekal. Several say he went through Leidenburg. Leidenburg's about here. And he took out the Bokoni on the way and settled somewhere here. Steelport is just there at the junction of the Dorps and the Steelport River. So no one knows where his kraal was. These red dots, there's 7 more of them there, were all potential Ekupumulenis, according to a lot of authors. But no one really knows. I think the most reliable probably site of it is what is Rasmussen's. He said he was here at Steelport. But while he was there, completely took out the Peri, dominated the entire area. There's a lot more that went on while he was there. But let's move on with the story. He left, and he headed southwest into the area of the Vaal. And this is what the early authors missed, but that Rasmussen has, I think, fairly conclusively proved. And he headed across the Highveld and arrived at what early people described as the Heidelberg Hills, or the Suikerbosrand. So we don't know where that kraal was, but somewhere near where that red dot is. And that cell is the domain that he set up there, according to Rasmussen. And in time, he established another big kraal at a place that he called Izinyosini, which is today's Potchefstroom. And you'll see how useful that became for him. So when he arrived there, he had all these tribes on his doorstep, which is just what he wanted. You know, it's a real licorice, all sorts of tribes. The Bamangwato, the Bakatla, the Bakwena, the Bankwaketsi, the Barutsi, the Baralong, the Batlapin, the Bataong, and then the Griquas at the bottom here. That's just a picture of a typical Baralong village. The people were living peacefully, happily. They didn't have defensive structures. Life was good until Mzilikaze pitched up. And the first thing he did was raid the Bankwaketsi. Then he went and raided the Baralong. And then he went and raided the Bataong and brought back huge amounts of cattle and started concentrating them along the Vaal there. He obviously knew about the Griqua, but before long the Griqua knew that he was accumulating a lot of cattle there, and the Griqua started stealing his cattle. The Griqua, the Korana, and the Sutus, all great cattle rustlers. And he couldn't stop them. They really harassed him along his southern boundary, and he decided to pack up and move north. And this sort of is the beginning of the 10 years in this part of the world. He evacuated the Vaal area. Authors give 4 possible routes. 3 of them go through this Commando Neck up here, and 1 through Horns Neck. But he moved up in 1827, the winter of 1827. He cleared out of the Vaal, leaving it very empty of people, which is a deliberate strategy of his. To the north of the Magaliesberg with the Bakwena, and apparently he pushed all the way through to the Pinars River, that blue line, and then swung back, decided not to go further north, liked the area, set up a huge kraal called Enkungwini, which is Wonderboom Port in Pretoria today, where the big tree is. And he also established another huge kraal called Mdinaneni, there next to Commander Neck, and took out the Kwena by Mahoba. They were defeated, so he sort of sorted that area out and settled in. Then he went for the Po. They were a little bit to one side there, and they were defeated. And a group went off to the Pilanesberg, Chief Pilani, after which the Pilanesberg is named. And another group went south, and Chief Magali was one of the Po who headed south. He went all the way to Lesotho, eventually came back. And a long story, the Magaliesberg was named after Chief Magali. So that's the area he originally came from. And a year later, Shaka is assassinated. And Dingaan becomes the king, the new king of the Zulu. And news eventually reaches Mzilikazi of this. In 1829, the very first Europeans arrive on the scene. 2 Scottish ivory traders, Robert Schoen and McClucky. And I'm putting this in because not far from here is a tree that was first seen by Schoen and McClucky on the 5th of August, 1829. It's known as the inhabited tree. It's a giant Ficus ingens, about 40 meters in diameter. It contained 14 huts, plus 3 being constructed when it was first seen. It was later seen by Moffat in 1830, then by Harris in 1836, and drawn by Thomas Baines in about 1869. That drawing on the left. So it was inhabited for a very long time. And that's a modern day image of the tree, supposedly the same tree, which is about 4 kilometers away from Kedar Lodge. Kedar Lodge is here, we're there. This is the main road to Sun City, and Moffat's tree is here on Bultfontein. This was an interesting thing that the first travelers encountered, were people living up in huts on top of poles. The left-hand diagram says it's a typical Bahurutsi hut to protect children from lions at night. Schoen and McClucky saw these for the first time, later seen by Campbell and drawn by C.D. Bell. That's his drawing or his interpretation of it, slightly different. But people were, obviously lions, man-eating lions were a huge problem in this part of the world. So they had to live like that or in trees. So now Mzilikazi settled into his Magaliesberg domain and starts raiding the Bankwaketsi. And bear in mind now, this is all documented because Schoen and McClucky were on the scene, and this is now accurate. He then went south, rustled cattle from the Bataung, and at the same time, at the end of the year, the Reverend Robert Moffat of the London Missionary Society visited Mzilikazi, and he met Kumbata, Mzilikazi's chief induna and prime minister. This is in Kuruman. And 10 days after leaving Kuruman, they reached Moseka. The whole time he was there, he witnessed the carnage and destruction. On his way up and through, he witnessed the carnage and destruction left behind after Mzilikazi's raids. And he met the Reverend James Archbell, his wife Elizabeth, and David Hume, a trader. And they traveled together to visit Mzilikazi at Nkungwini, which is where Vonneboom Poort is. That's a painting of Robert Moffat around about the time he visited Mzilikazi. And there I've sort of traced his route on Google Earth. There's Moseka, Moffat's mission down there, Maritsani, Moseka, and then he just headed straight to the east, went past Dinaneni to Nkungwini. But he didn't leave very accurate geographical information about where he went. But this trip began a strange friendship that lasted for 39 years and saw 5 visits to Mzilikazi. 2 while he was in this area and 3 while he was in Rhodesia or Matabele land. Undeterred, after Robert Moffat had tried to preach to him and tell him not to be so violent and do all the dreadful things he was doing, he then took out the Bankwaketsi again, went on a huge raid there, and in 1830 he got really ambitious. He had heard about Mgibe, chief of the Mashona cattle breeders up in what's Zimbabwe today, southern Zimbabwe, and he went all the way up there, or sent regiments, I think it was 5 regiments, to go and rustle their cattle. And while those regiments were way up there, I presume successfully raiding cattle and whatever else they could get up there, Dingaan arrived on the scene. Now Dingaan looked upon Mzilikazi as Zululand's greatest enemy. He wished to exterminate the Matabele. And he launched an attack. The outcome was indecisive. Many warriors on both sides died. And the Zulus hastily returned, taking as many cattle as they could round up. Thus they retrieved the quota of cattle once stolen by Mzilikazi from Shaka. And from the information I've got, it might not be very clear there, but the battle site was apparently between the Sand River on the left and the Apis River on the right. And the Matabele fled into hills and drew the Zulus after them. And I can only think it was somewhere here, somewhere near Brits. This was in the spring of 1830 that Dingaan's attack took place and was repulsed. So now back to business. 1831, Mzilikazi's got a breather, and he decides to go and fetch some cattle from Chief Mosheshwe in Lesotho at Thaba Bosiu. Look at the distance. He sends his regiments down there. It's a long story. After 3 days, they were eventually repulsed. They could not get to the top of Thaba Bosiu, and Mosheshwe was a great diplomat, and he made peace, and he gave them cattle to go home, and from that day on, Mzilikazi lived in peace with Mosheshwe. But again, back to business. He took out the Bamangwato. He hadn't tackled them before. Lots of cattle to go and fetch there. And the Bahurutsi, which is not far from here. Their capital was Moseka. And round about this time, the Griquas and the Coronas and many of Mzilikazi's enemies from previously raided areas decided to go on a cattle raid. And they were very bold. They went straight through a place called Makwasi. Oh, their chief was a fellow called Barnes. He was old. He was in his 80s. He stopped at Makwasi and he sent them on right into the middle of, well, the sort of western side of Mzilikazi's area and raided cattle successfully and got away with it, well, for a while. They took some women as hostages, and while they were celebrating at a place which is today called Moordkop, and Moordkop's up there at the tip of that arrow. The Matabele tracked them for 3 days, and I think it was on the 3rd night, or dawn, they attacked them, and they wiped them out completely. So they got their cattle back, and the Griqua were wiped out. And anyway, that's at a place called Moordkop, which is up to the north here. And that's a Google Earth image of it. It seems to be a big granite outcrop, but that's where they were taken out. Carried on raiding, got rid of the Tlokwa, sent them packing, got rid of the Phokeng and the Khatla, sending them all around to the west, around the Polanisberg, and this lot called the Kwena Ba Modi Mosana Ba Matu. So he was clearing out his western boundaries then, and in 1832 he again attacked the Baralong, again stocking up on cattle, women, young men, grain, everything he needed. But in the autumn of 1832, Dingaan again declared war on Mzilikazi. The Zulus announced their arrival by laying waste to the first of the enemy kraals and carrying off some 140 head of cattle. So they presumably came in from the southeast near Nkongwini. A fierce battle later ensued, but ended in a stalemate. 3 Zulu regiments were wiped out, and the Zulus retreated for home, fearing a massive attack by reserves of Mzilikazi. They realized they'd run out of luck. And that was the last battle between Dingaan and Mzilikazi, but it rattled him enough to force him to move to the west, into the Mariko area in September 1832. That's documented by missionaries that were living at Moseka. And those are 3 of the sort of routes that they took as they vacated the Magaliesberg area and emptied out all those kraals. And there were cattle kraals, royal kraals, military kraals, packed them all up and went and burnt them down. Presumably he normally did that, and moved into the Mariko. That's the Groot Mariko River running up the center of this cell here. Yeah, he set up a series of powerful military stations to guard all flanks, and many other kraals were built adjacent to the main kraals. Moseka alone had between 15 and 20 kraals. And he stationed his four generals. So there were 4 big military kraals then. Moseka down at the bottom here, Chwenyani, Kampu, and Kabeni or Kapen up there. Sibeka was his general to the north, Kampu is general there, Marapi and his top general Mkalipi down at the south here, because that's where I think he feared the Griquas coming back, because I didn't mention it earlier, the Griquas had horses and guns, which Mzilikazi couldn't match. He couldn't deal with them. So he couldn't stand the Griquas. But once he had settled in 1834, attacked the Baralong again, the Bankwaketsi, and the Bakwena, stocked up as usual. And that's just a historic picture of a typical kraals that were in the hills in the area. Another one, people living peacefully in the hills. So getting back down to Mkalipi in 1834, his foremost duty was to guard the southern approaches to the Matabele kingdom. Mzilikazi decreed that no strangers could cross the Vaal without his permission, fearing the Griqua. And while patrolling the Vaal, they came across some Griqua hunters and their families. They slew everyone in camp, but spared the lives of 2. Trui, the daughter, and Willem, the nephew of Peter Davids, who was the leader of the Griqua party. They were taken to Moseka. Trui became a concubine in one of the despot's harems, and Willem became a headman of the tribe. He actually was quite respected by Mzilikazi. He proved his value and his loyalty. And that's just a picture of what it must have been like to face Matabele warriors attacking with their big shields and their assegais. Then in 1834, Andrew Geddes Bain a Craftrenet trader, geologist, road engineer, paleontologist, and explorer, accompanied by Griqua and Corona servants on a commission from American clients to collect trophies and skins, set off towards Mzilikazi's area. On the way, some of his Griqua turned from hunting to raiding Matabele cattle posts, which quickly turned into a disaster. A Matabele regiment soon descended upon him, and he fled, losing all of his possessions, which were taken back to Moseka, never to be retrieved. Wagons, skins, trophies, the lot. So he got away with his life, but made the big mistake of taking Griquas with him. And there I've kind of retraced his trip on Google Earth, and thanks to Smith's map, he's pointed out where Bain's wagons were abandoned by Bain, and it's easy to find that place on Google Earth. So you can see the sort of trajectory. He was heading up there, and he wanted to go and get permission from Mzilikazi, but his Griquas messed it up for him. Then in 1835, Dr. Andrew Smith, Director General of the Medical Department of the British Army, mounted an expedition for exploring Central Africa. And this was to be a 3-year expedition. He was accompanied by John Burrow, surveyor and astronomer, Charles Bell, the expedition artist, and many others, including Robert Schoon, the first person to visit Mzilikazi, and David Hume, who had been there before as well. And they traveled in Mzilikazi's domain in June and July 1835. And Smith, at Mzilikazi's request, returned with 2 of Mzilikazi's advisors who forged an alliance with the Cape Colony. They went all the way back to Cape Town. And that's the route he took, a very accurate map. Every one of these little black bars with a little white bar in between is a day's trek with the wagons and where they outspanned and how they went with the dates. And from that, I could reconstruct his trip on Google Earth. It's the pink line. And if I just tilt that in 3 dimensions, the route he took was actually to the south of the Magaliesberg Range, down the Salons River, and around through the Kashan Valley, and went through the port there at Hartbeespoort Dam via Indinaneni. These kraals had been abandoned by then. But then took a trip through that area, went right around the northern edge of Pilanesberg, kind of where we went yesterday, went up towards the Limpopo, and finally back again. And Moffat accompanied Smith to see Mzilikazi in June 1835, and his objectives were to secure timber for his mission station at Kuruman, to get Mzilikazi's permission for missionaries of the American Board to settle at Moseka, to try to get Trui and Willem released, and to try to retrieve Bain's wagons and specimens. They were diverted past Moseka and met Mzilikazi at an outpost beyond Egabini. Moffat remained for 2 months and was feted and given gifts by Mzilikazi. He again witnessed horrific atrocities and killings, and he and Mzilikazi traveled back together as far as the Malopo River. So Mzilikazi actually went with him, selecting the timber for his mission. And here are some pictures that C.D. Bell did. That was the first reception with Mzilikazi. Moffat here with a beard. Bell sitting over, Smith sitting over there, Mzilikazi in the chair, and the other fellows on the trip at the meeting. And this is a bit more about Charles Davidson Bell, the artist. He was born in Scotland. He arrived at the Cape in 1830 at the invitation of his uncle, Colonel John Bell, who was then colonial secretary. He was a polymath who excelled at anything he could put his hands to. He joined the expedition at the age of 21 and was tasked with keeping a pictorial diary of the expedition. And here we see some of the first pictures. Our Zulu guard of honor, One can see their attire, standing around a fire, some war dancing, more war dancing, with the Europeans sitting in the bottom left there. Here, this is a train of bakwenas with supplies for Mzilikazi, the kind of thing that had been going on for years and years, probably a common sight wherever these travelers went, bringing tribute back to Mzilikazi. Here's a scene that he painted of one of the kraals. No one knows which one, but there you can see that vast circular kraal, typical of Mzilikazi's kraals at the time. I don't know if there's some artistic license there, if it really was that big, but they were huge. Here's a rhino hunt next to the Kashan Mountains, or Magaliesberg. They went through the Crocodile River Gorge, also known as the Uri then. And in 1836, some missionaries were sent by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, and they had settled at Maseka, the Reverend Lindley, Reverend Venable, and Dr. Wilson. They rebuilt a missionary station that had been founded a few years earlier by missionaries of the Paris Evangelical Missionary Society, Roland Lemieux and Pellissier. These French missionaries were the ones that documented his move across to Maseka. And in 1836, another character arrived on the scene, William Cornwallis Harris. He was an English military engineer, artist, and hunter. Those are two pictures of him as a young man and then on his trip through Mzilikazi's area. And they drew a very Harris himself drew a very detailed map which helped me enormously. Africa northeast of the Cape Colony, exhibiting the relative positions of the immigrant farmers and the native tribes. And again, I could reconstruct his route, very similar to Smith's route. And when he exited, he actually went south through Isin-Yosini, which is today Potchefstroom, and headed south. So he came in from that side, went as far as Gabeni, got permission to do this trip, again up towards the Limpopo and back again. That's a 3D view of the trip, very similar to Smith's route. And these are some pictures that, well, the first one to the left is Cornwallis Harris's picture of Mzilikazi. And then these three to the right, I think were all done, they're all modern renditions. But I found all four on the internet. So if one must assume that's pretty much what he looked like and how he dressed. A Matabele warrior. Vincent Carruthers in his book thinks it's Mkalipi. I don't know. I'd like to find the original picture in the book. But one of his paintings. And here is one of Cornwallis Harris's paintings of traveling along in a wagon past a typical kraal on the hillside. And there's Mzilikazi with a blue cape, red tartan trousers, and I think this is Cornwallis Harris sitting on the wagon next to him, talking to him. The dog there, and a warrior, stark naked, trotting along next door. So I thought, I'd like to try and use a modern tool, artificial intelligence imaging, and feed in some things and just see if I can get a picture of what Mzilikazi looked like. And we came up with that. We ran out of time. We had a lot of fun around the dinner table, but you carry on doing iterations. So the next iteration, I perhaps should have said barefoot, and then we would have got another one. You can keep going until we'd get to probably something like he looked. But quite an interesting tool. There's another picture of Harris's, a kraal on the left coming down to water the livestock in the Kashan Mountains. And this, according to Revel Mason in his book, is the earliest archaeological illustration in the Transvaal. It's in this area, and it's the ruins of an Iron Age village. So it's kind of stuff we've been seeing a lot of, and there's so much of it around this area. Somehow or another, the rhino got trapped in the middle of it, and they shot it. But that's, I thought, was a bit of interesting history. He was famous for being the first to discover the Harris buck, or the sable, in the Kashan Valley. And then he packed up and went south. Same year, the Great Trek got underway. Some voortrekkers crossed the Vaal. An impi of about 600 Matabele murdered 15 to 17 Afrikaner voortrekkers on the Vaal River, abducting 3 children. On the 9th of October, just following up on that, Mzilikaze sent an army of 5,000 Matabele warriors to attack the voortrekkers, and they were attacked on the 16th of October 1836 at Vegkop near Heilbron. Around 33 adult men and 7 boys defended the laager. The attack on the laager commenced at noon and lasted for about half an hour. 2 voortrekkers and about 400 Matabele died. However, the Matabele plundered 50,000 sheep and goats and 5,000 cattle, including all their draft cattle. That was just a picture of a sort of what it must have looked like to them. There's a picture of them defending the laager at Vegkop, reloading the muzzle loaders. In 1837, the voortrekkers planned a revenge attack. So these voortrekkers retreated to Tabanchu, and more voortrekkers arrived from the Cape, and they planned a revenge attack to recover their cattle. Gert Maritz and Hendrik Potgieter were elected as leaders, and they departed Tabanchu on the 2nd of January 1837. There were 107 voortrekkers and 100 auxiliaries. They crossed the Vaal at Commando Drift, and they followed the approved route so as not to arouse suspicion. And the trip took 15 days. That's just plotting it on Google Earth from Tabanchu through Commando Drift up to Moseka. So that was a 15-day trip to go and take revenge on Mzilikazi, and amazingly they arrived undetected. They began their attack early at daybreak on the 17th of January. Potgieter did a flanking attack. Maritz did a frontal attack. They succeeded in the attack and chased warriors as far as today's Zeerust. They destroyed about 16 settlements by fire. They killed about 400 warriors. No voortrekker was killed or wounded. 2 auxiliaries lost their lives. The battle was over by midday, and they took the American missionaries back with them. They told them, look, you've got no choice. You'll just be murdered if you stay here. They had to pack 2 ox wagons within an hour. And they recovered more than 6,000 head of cattle and some sheep, and they retreated, riding through the night and really pushing it until they reached their wagons at Commando Drift. So that was the first attack. There's a little map of it. They started at a place called Eintjiesekop up top here. And there was where the Battle of Moseka was. That's today's Zeerust there. This is the Klein Mariko River. And the Matabele fled, a lot of them along the riverline, taking cover in the reeds. And they were quickly found by the Boers there on horseback, and they were slaughtered in the reeds, in the reed beds. And we went there 3 days ago just to try and find this site. There's a big signboard on the road to Mafeking called Moseka, so you can't miss the turnoff. But you really have to have a good map to find this little memorial. Quite amazing that we did find it. But it's there, it's next to a railway line on a real rough bush track. And that was 186 years ago, that from today when the battle took place. And then towards the end of 1837, the second Revenge Commando set out in the last months of the year. It was led by Hendrik Potgieter and Piet Uys. They departed from Winburg. They assembled at Kameeldoring, which is on the outskirts of today's Zeerust, and they began the so-called 9-day campaign, also known as the Battle of Gabeni. This lasted from the 4th to the 13th of November. And they set fire to every kraal along the way. And Mzilikazi and about 15,000 followers fled northwards. And I've been able to, that's the route up from Winburg to Moseka or Kameeldoring outside Zeerust. And that red sort of thing there is the route they took over the 9 days, flushing Mzilikazi out of the Mariko. So there's Kameeldoring. There's Trinyani military kraal, Kampu military kraal, Kabeni, and they just pushed the Zulus northwards. In front of the Zulus was the Dwarsberge with 3 poorts, eerste, tweede and derde poort, and these Matabeles fled through those 3 poorts, kind of like squeezing a tube of toothpaste, and they all had to, that was the only way they could escape the Boers, through the Dwarsberg and the 3 poorts. There's a bit of a zoomed in image of the 3 poorts, with the, bearing in mind that 15,000 people and countless livestock fled through the 3 poorts. And there's the Dwarsberg right at the bottom here. As they exited Derdepoort, they split. This must have been going on over many days, and there must have been well-worn paths. Mzilikaze took the left route, following a lot of people that had fled, or maybe he led the flight, and another fellow took a path to the right. That was in Tumbani. And Mzilikaze, so I'm coming to the end now because I'm not going to cover this part of the story. They're now out of the Magaliesberg and the Marika, where they've been for 10 years. Mzilikaze went all the way up to Lake Ngami, skirted around the Okavango up to the Chobe, wanted to take out the tribe there, the Mokoloko, I think they were called, headed back to the Makarikari, and got to about here when this fellow, who had gone through the Soutpansberg, Gwanda, and had set up here, sent a search party looking for Mzilikaze. So Mzilikaze eventually arrived at Bulawayo. That's a bit of a zoomed in image of it, just some places of interest. Gibitego was in Tumbani's first kraal. He was murdered here in Tabazanduna because Mzilikaze considered them to be traitors. He killed Tumbani plus 11 of his chief generals and councillors, and that's where Mzilikaze's grave is. I mean, that's a whole book in itself. So the aftermath, Mzilikaze left the country for good. The downtrodden tribes of the previous 16 years largely reoccupied their previous territories, and the Boers, by right of conquest, very quickly occupied and settled the entire Transvaal. And that's just a picture from that brochure we got yesterday, 1868, 30 years after Mzilikaze had departed, a typical Sotho-Tswana settlement in 1868. So life got back to normal in this part of the world. And then just some things to ponder. 4 of Mzilikaze's biggest kraals became future Boer cities: Heidelberg, Potchefstroom, Pretoria, and Rustenburg. And 2 of them became Boer capitals. So why did the Boers settle in those areas that had previously been occupied by Mzilikaze? Very interesting. They must have seen the strategic benefits, maybe the agricultural benefits, I don't know, but that's quite interesting. And then here, just a picture of Mzilikaze. These are what negative attributes that I've picked up in various books, the kind of things you don't want on your CV. Brutal despot, butcher, conqueror, dictator, mass murderer, and he murdered his own children, oppressor, roving predator, and tyrant. And I think they all accurately describe him. But then on the plus side, kind of things you want on your CV, he was a great general, a great leader, founder of the Matabele nation, and a king.